if you want to destroy a nation, you don't actually need to capture its capital city.
Okay.
You don't need to occupy every single square inch of physical territory. You just need to keep the population awake, afraid, exhausted, and, well, suspicious of their neighbors for a few consecutive years.
And that does it.
Break the collective mind, and the physical borders they'll just eventually collapse on their own.
Welcome to Reform Thinking. Today we are doing a deep dive into a text that takes our conventional understanding of warfare and just completely flips it upside down.
It really does.
We're analyzing a comprehensive essay titled The Invisible Front: Mental Health as National Security in Ukraine's Long War. And the core mission of our discussion today is to break down a very specific, challenging argument that the author makes.
Right.
The text argues that the psychological condition of a nation is not a secondary humanitarian issue. It's not, something you deal with after the dust settles and the peace treaties are signed.
Yeah, it's a primary national security priority right now. Right. We always hear that wars are fought with artillery, drones, supply chains. But this text makes the case that a nation can lose its internal cohesion long before it loses an inch of physical territory.
That is the central thesis we're analyzing today. The author notes that human suffering is, first and foremost, a moral reality.
Right.
When people endure terror or displacement, they require care simply because they are human beings. But in a long defensive conflict, moral obligation and strategic necessity collide.
Yeah, they crash right into each other.
Spot on. A state must begin to treat psychological care as hard infrastructure. I want you to think of mental health clinics and community support networks as being as vital to national defense as air defense systems or electricity grids.
Wow. That's a massive shift in perspective.
It is. Now, as we go through this material, I want to clarify the objective nature of our reporting today. We are evaluating the claims, the clinical models, and the data presented in this text regarding mental health policy.
Right, just looking at the facts.
Yeah. We are looking at the strategic calculus outlined by the author. We are not taking political sides or endorsing specific political viewpoints. We're just unpacking the author's argument that a society must integrate psychological care into its defense strategy, or else, well, it pays a massive price in institutional collapse.
Okay, let's unpack this by looking at the sheer scale of the situation.
Right.
Because to grasp why mental health moves from a medical category to a literal security issue, we first have to establish the massive nationwide scale of the psychological toll described in the source material.
Yeah.
We are not talking about isolated incidents here. The numbers presented in this text are, frankly, they're staggering.
They are massive. So the text cites reports from the World Health Organization and the United Nations from February 2026.
Okay.
According to those surveys, 72% of surveyed Ukrainians experienced anxiety or depression in the previous year.
Wait, really? 72%?
72%. Try to visualize that in a normal setting. If you walk into a grocery store or a post office or a factory, 7 out of every 10 people you see are managing active anxiety or depression.
Oh my goodness.
And yet the data shows that only 1 in 5 sought professional help.
Only 1 in 5.
Yeah. The author also breaks down estimates from the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, from February 2025. They estimated 10.6 million people were displaced.
That number is it's hard to wrap your head around.
It really is. That breaks down to 3.7 million internally displaced within the borders of the country and 6.9 million refugees abroad. Furthermore, the text highlights that 1.5 million children are at risk of long-term psychological consequences.
So what does this all mean for the actual functioning of the state? Because the text uses a fascinating analogy here. It calls these clinical numbers warning lights on the dashboard of national resilience.
I love that analogy.
Right. If you're driving a car and the engine temperature light flashes red, you don't just put a piece of opaque tape over it and keep driving.
You pull over.
Yeah, you pull over because the engine block is going to physically melt. The author is arguing that these psychological indicators are doing the exact same thing for the state machinery.
Yes, chronic fear exhausts a population.
It limits economic productivity, it limits trust in civic institutions, it drains the engine,
What is fascinating here is how the author connects that chronic emotional exhaustion directly to state function. If fear becomes the normal atmospheric condition of national life, citizens will adapt outwardly.
Right, they still go to work.
Yeah, they go to work, they buy groceries. But inwardly, they narrow their horizons strictly to survival.
Yeah.
They stop planning for the future.
Oh.
They stop investing. The result is a slow, grinding attrition of the society. The warning lights indicate that the human foundations of resistance are running dangerously low.
I was thinking about this like a communal battery. Society often praises courage and resilience so loudly that the battery drains completely.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Everyone is expected to be strong, stoic, and unshakable all the time. But that social expectation can actually backfire. It makes the wounded feel guilty for needing a recharge.
They think, well, I shouldn't complain. My neighbor lost their home, and the soldier on the front line has it worse.
Right. So they don't seek help, which perfectly explains that only 1 in 5 statistic you mentioned earlier.
It does.
But here is where I want to push back a little on the author's premise. I want to ask a critical question. In a war zone, feeling anxious or depressed seems, well, entirely rational.
Sure.
If missiles are falling, anxiety is a sane response to an insane situation. How does a state distinguish between sane, normal distress in wartime and a disabling clinical injury without trivializing either one?
That is a critical distinction, and the author insists on clarifying it. Sadness, fear, anger, and grief are not diseases in this context.
Okay.
They are entirely sane responses to devastation. The text explicitly warns against pathologizing a brave population. You don't want to label normal human grief as a psychiatric disorder.
Right, that would be completely counterproductive.
However, the distinction lies in function. When distress becomes persistent, severe, isolating, or functionally impairing, meaning a person can no longer sleep, care for their children, or perform their job.
Then it's an injury.
Yes, it crosses from a natural response into an injury that requires intervention. To manage this massive spectrum of need without trivializing the normal human response, the author outlines a layered model of care.
So the state can't just build 1,000 new psychiatric hospitals and call it a day. The model has to be more nuanced. Let's build that model together. What is the foundation?
It is essentially a public health pyramid. At the wide base of the pyramid, you have psychological first aid for the masses.
Okay.
This is basic support. It is not therapy. It involves ensuring physical safety, providing clear information, and offering practical help. It is about grounding people in the immediate present.
Okay, so psychological first aid is just stabilizing the situation. But what happens to the people who need more than just a grounding exercise? They don't all go straight to a clinician, right?
Right. The next layer up is community support for moderate distress. Think of local groups, school teachers, and primary care doctors, recognizing the signs of distress and offering steadying routines.
That makes sense.
This tier manages the bulk of the population's ongoing stress. Then, as the pyramid narrows, you move up to specialized treatment for severe symptoms.
So this is where the professionals come in.
Yes. This tier requires highly trained clinicians, psychologists, and psychiatrists to handle acute trauma responses. Finally, at the very top, the sharpest point of the pyramid, you have long-term, intensive rehabilitation.
For the most severe cases.
Correct. This is reserved for veterans with severe brain injuries, survivors of captivity, and those with complex overlapping traumas. The state needs all these layers functioning simultaneously, feeding into one another.
So we have this massive scale of societal exhaustion and a theoretical pyramid to handle it. But what happens when the exhaustion is not just tiredness, but actual physiological damage? Let's look at where this trauma is actually happening. Historically, we think of a front line where the soldiers are and a home front where the civilians are making the ammunition and planting the crops. But the text argues that modern warfare has totally erased the geographic boundaries of trauma. The home front is entirely permeable now.
If we connect this to the broader reality of modern military technology, drones and ballistic missiles completely blur the line between the combat zone and civilian space.
Right, there is no real safe zone.
The text cites data from the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. Between December 2024 and May 2025, they recorded 968 civilians killed and 4,807 injured by explosive weapons, urban attacks, and short-range drones.
Wow.
This was a 37% increase from the previous period. The violence is reaching straight over the trenches and into the civilian infrastructure.
And the text makes a crucial point here. Those casualty numbers, tragic as they are, they don't capture the psychological blast radius.
No, they don't.
The physical explosion happens in a city square, but the trauma ripples outward for miles. The injury includes the children who witnessed the attack from a window.
Right.
It includes the relatives frantically searching the hospital wards hours later. It includes the ambulance workers who have to scrape up the aftermath and then, go back to their own dark, unheated apartments after pulling a 24-hour shift.
Yeah, it's exhausting.
The trauma is the anticipation itself. It is the grandmother who was evacuated from her village, constantly wondering if her house is still standing. It is the teacher who has to try and hold the attention of 20 children in a math class while the air raid siren is screaming outside. The boundary of the battlefield is just gone.
That is a highly accurate way to frame it. The author defines the traumatic event as being much broader than just the physical explosion. The trauma is the constant, never-ending calculation of risk.
Yes, never being able to turn it off.
It is the total absence of a predictable, safe routine.
Mm.
And the strategy of the aggressor often deliberately targets the very systems that are supposed to provide that safety.
Right.
For instance, the text highlights World Health Organization data documenting 2,881 attacks on healthcare facilities by February 2026.
Wait, 2,881 attacks on hospitals, clinics, and ambulances. That is an astonishing figure.
Yes. The text argues that when hospitals, supply chains, and power grids are struck, the very places designated for healing become wounded themselves.
It's so insidious.
It creates a strategic environment of exhaustion. The aggressor's goal is to make the target population feel that there is no safe harbor anywhere. Not in a hospital, not in a school, not in their own beds.
But let me challenge the strategic logic of this attrition warfare for a second. Let's look at history. If a population is attacked from the air, acute fear often mobilizes them.
That's true.
We saw this during the Blitz in London. People rally together when bombed. The threat creates a unified, defiant spirit. So if acute fear mobilizes a population and makes them fight harder, what does chronic fear do? Why is chronic fear such a specific, fatal threat to the state?
This is where we have to look at human biology. Acute fear causes a massive spike in adrenaline and epinephrine. It prepares the body to fight or flee.
Right, the survival instinct.
It creates a highly unified short-term response. You are absolutely correct about that. But the human endocrine system is not designed to sustain that state of high alert indefinitely.
It just burns out.
When acute fear transitions into chronic fear, the body relies on a steady drip of cortisol. The text argues that chronic, multi-year fear fundamentally exhausts the brain.
Wow.
It degrades memory formation, ruins sleep architecture, and impairs complex judgment. When people are biologically exhausted for years on end, their cognitive bandwidth literally shrinks.
So they stop thinking about the grand strategy of the nation and just focus on getting through the afternoon.
Precisely. Frightened, tired people seek simple explanations for their suffering. This makes them highly vulnerable to disinformation, rumors, and psychological operations.
Oh, I see.
They want immediate relief at any cost, and they become far less capable of participating in civic life or making rational long-term decisions. So chronic fear directly impacts state security by degrading the cognitive and social resilience of the population. The population becomes brittle.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. You shift from fighting the enemy to just trying to survive Tuesday. And when your biology is farting against you, mistakes happen.
Yeah.
Moving from that general civilian trauma, the text zeroes in on specific clinical conditions that arise from this chronic exposure. The biggest one we hear about is PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And the author looks closely at the tangible, downstream effects this condition has on a nation's functioning.
The author distinguishes between the rigid clinical definition of PTSD and its practical daily realities.
Right.
Clinically, PTSD involves intrusive memories, severe avoidance behaviors, negative changes in mood, and a state of hyperarousal following exposure to a severe threat.
But the practical impact is what brings it home for the listener. The text gives such vivid, grounded examples. It's not just a sterile definition in a psychiatric manual.
No, it's very real.
PTSD is a combat medic who smells copper blood when walking into an ordinary, perfectly safe kitchen. It's a mother who physically cannot stop her hands from shaking and cannot sleep because her child is 10 minutes late coming home from a friend's house.
Yeah.
It's a soldier on rotation who is sitting in his quiet living room watching television, but his central nervous system is physiologically still shivering in a trench.
To quantify this reality, the text cites a 2024 open access study published in Psychiatry Research. They surveyed a large sample of adults living in Ukraine 1 year after the full-scale invasion.
Okay, what did they find?
The numbers provide a sobering map of the landscape. 14.4% of the respondents had probable PTSD. Another 8.9% met the criteria for complex PTSD.
That's intense.
And 44.2% had probable depressive disorder. And 38.6% showed significant persistent loneliness.
That is nearly half the adult population showing probable depressive disorder. Half. Think about what that means for a society.
And this study highlights a crucial mechanism. the dose-response association.
What does that mean practically?
This means there is a clear, direct, and measurable correlation between the number of trauma events a person experiences and the severity of the resulting PTSD.
Oh, I see.
The more times you are exposed to the blast radius, the more times you are displaced, or the more times you witness violence, the exponentially higher the likelihood of sustaining a severe psychological injury. It accumulates.
So let's look at the practical systemic fallout of those numbers. For the military, the text states that untreated combat stress impairs concentration, erodes trust within units, and degrades judgment under fire.
Yeah.
A soldier with a hyperactive threat detection system might react aggressively to a non-threat, or freeze when action is required. But it is not just a military issue. The author looks at the civilian sector and economic capital.
Right. It touches everything.
Untreated PTSD severely reduces employability. It ruins focus. It aggravates substance use as people try to self-medicate their nervous systems. So I have to ask, how does untreated trauma affect a country that needs a highly competent, energized workforce to rebuild roads, factories, and schools?
It's a huge problem.
If a massive percentage of your population has complex PTSD, who is going to do the physical and mental labor of reconstruction?
That is the core economic argument of the text. Treating mental health is not charity. It is a vital investment in human capital.
Right.
A traumatized workforce drastically lowers overall productivity and increases absenteeism. If millions of people cannot concentrate on a task or cooperate with colleagues over a span of years, reconstruction completely stalls. The economy cannot recover. But getting that necessary treatment to the workforce is complicated by a massive, invisible barrier.
Stigma.
Right. The old school idea that admitting you are hurting is a moral failing or a sign of weakness.
The text argues that in many military and civilian cultures, stigma is an active, severe security vulnerability. It acts as a camouflage for the injury. Wow. Camouflage for the injury. That's a powerful way to put it.
It hides widespread problems until they fester into absolute crises. Men, in particular, might be highly reluctant to seek help due to cultural expectations of stoicism.
Yeah.
Soldiers fear that reporting a symptom will mean losing their status in the unit or having their weapons taken away.
Yeah.
Civilians fear being labeled unstable by their employers or neighbors. Because of this, evidence-based care must be deployed highly strategically to overcome that cultural stigma. You can't just open a clinic and expect people to walk in.
And the text mentions specific validated therapies, right? It says, good intentions and a sympathetic ear are not enough to fix a malfunctioning nervous system.
Correct. While peer listening and community rituals are highly valuable for general distress, severe PTSD requires validated clinical approaches. The text lists trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapies, cognitive processing therapy, and EMDR.
I want to pause on EMDR because I hear that acronym a lot. We need to explain the mechanics here. How does a therapy like EMDR actually work to fix the brain? It stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, right?
Yes. To understand EMDR, you have to understand how trauma is stored. Normally, your brain processes memories and files them away in the hippocampus, which is like the brain's long-term filing cabinet.
Oh, okay.
Remember the event, but the emotional sting is gone. But during a severe trauma, the system gets overwhelmed. The memory does not get filed properly. It gets stuck in the amygdala, the brain's raw emotional threat detection center.
Oh, wow.
The brain acts as if the trauma is still happening right now. The alarm bell is jammed.
So a loud noise happens, and the brain genuinely believes it is back in the combat zone.
That's right. EMDR aims to unstick that memory. The clinician has the patient recall the distressing image, but simultaneously introduces bilateral stimulation, usually by having the patient track the therapist's finger moving left and right with their eyes.
And what does moving your eyes back and forth actually do to a traumatic memory? I mean, it sounds almost too simple.
It taxes the working memory. Your brain only has a certain amount of processing bandwidth. By forcing the brain to track a moving object while simultaneously bringing up the traumatic memory, the brain simply cannot maintain the high emotional intensity of the memory.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
The bilateral stimulation dilutes the emotional charge. Over repeated sessions, the memory gets properly processed, the emotional intensity drops, and the memory is finally filed away in the hippocampus.
So it finally goes into the filing cabinet.
Yes, the brain learns that the event is in the past. But the text is clear. Treatments like EMDR and trauma-focused CDT must be adapted to the local language, metaphors, and military culture to be effective.
Here is where it gets incredibly fascinating and honestly quite heavy. While PTSD centers on fear and a broken threat detection system, the text introduces another overlapping but very distinct wound: And this wound has to be addressed if a state wants to prevent its society from completely fracturing. We are talking about moral injury.
Moral injury is a crucial, distinct concept here. The text uses the definition provided by the U.S. National Center for PTSD. It defines moral injury as the deep anguish that follows when people participate in, witness, fail to prevent, or suffer betrayal in events that violate their firmly held moral values.
I want to use a mechanical analogy to separate these two concepts for anyone listening. If PTSD is a glitch in the brain's hardware, the threat detection alarm bell will not stop ringing, then moral injury is a catastrophic crash in the brain's operating system.
That's a great way to think about it.
The fundamental rules, the source code you rely on to understand right and wrong, have been rewritten by the trauma, and your brain doesn't know how to compute your own actions anymore. The author gives examples that just stop you in your tracks. A commander who has to order a tactical withdrawal, knowing full well he is leaving wounded bodies behind. A combat medic who has to perform rapid triage and make the terrible decision about who gets the last available tourniquet, knowing the other person will bleed out.
Yeah, awful decisions.
Or a civilian living in an occupied territory who complies with the enemy outwardly, maybe handing over supplies, just to keep their children alive.
Those examples perfectly illustrate why a purely medical psychiatric model falls completely short here. A person suffering from moral injury doesn't walk into a clinic and say, I have symptoms of heightened arousal and intrusive thoughts.
Yeah.
They walk in and say, I am unforgivable, or I betrayed my best friend, or God has abandoned me. The anguish is rooted in a perception of intense guilt, shame, and shattered trust, not just a fear of physical danger.
And the scientific research on this specific injury is apparently lagging far behind the reality on the ground, significantly. The text points to a 2025 scoping review of 32 different studies looking at active duty personnel and veterans in Ukraine. The review highlighted massive, glaring research gaps.
Really?
The country is generating complex moral experiences at a scale and speed far faster than clinicians can categorize them or figure out how to treat them. The standard psychiatric playbook does not have a quick fix for a shattered conscience.
This raises a really difficult question, and I want to push on this based on the text. Let's talk about the national narrative. If a nation is fighting a defensive war for its survival, the public narrative is usually entirely about heroism.
Sure.
It is framed as pure good versus pure evil, absolute defense against aggression. Does addressing moral injury and admitting that your own soldiers or civilians might feel intense guilt or shame about the terrible things they had to do to survive conflict with that public narrative of a purely heroic war? Doesn't acknowledging guilt undermine the war effort? The author anticipates that tension, and it is a vital point of vulnerability for a state. The text draws a sharp contrast between state propaganda and true moral seriousness.
Okay, what's the difference?
Propaganda demands absolute purity. It dictates a narrative that says, our side is purely good, our actions are flawless, therefore no one should feel any guilt whatsoever.
Right.
But moral seriousness acknowledges the dark, tragic reality of human conflict. It acknowledges that even in a highly justified, purely defensive war, people encounter immense tragedy, fatal errors, and severe moral ambiguity. Denying that reality only isolates the veterans who know the truth.
Right, because if the state says you are a spotless hero, and the soldier thinks I am a monster for what I had to do, that soldier is completely alienated from the society they fought to protect. So how do you fix a broken moral compass? A pharmaceutical pill is not going to cure the feeling of guilt.
The solution proposed in the source material is a concept called moral repair. This is not a quick clinical fix. It involves the truthful public acknowledgement of the event. It involves taking responsibility where responsibility is genuinely real. It includes lament for losses that simply cannot be fixed, and restitution where harm can actually be repaired.
So it's much broader than just going to therapy.
Yes. Crucially, it requires a community that is willing to bear witness to the ugly truth of the war without turning it into a spectacle or a political weapon. The legal system, religious institutions, community groups, and the arts all play a massive role in this repair, working alongside clinical therapy.
We have spent a lot of time examining those internal wounds, the physiological hardware glitch of PTSD, and the operating system crash of moral injury. Now, the analysis shifts to look at how these internal wounds impact the core external units of society, families and local communities. Let's go back to that number of 10.6 million displaced individuals.
Yeah.
That figure is just hard to wrap your head around. Almost a quarter of the pre-war population living away from their actual homes.
To understand the impact, We have to recognize that displacement is not a single past event. It is not just the day you packed a suitcase and left. The text makes it very clear that displacement is a continuing chronic condition.
It doesn't just stop.
No, it is an ongoing reality that generates friction and stress every single day. It involves lost physical property, highly unstable employment, the constant frustration of bureaucratic uncertainty, and the deep, persistent ache of geographical separation from family.
Wow.
For the refugees who fled abroad, they might be safe from physical bombs, but they face immense language barriers, the loss of professional credentials, and a severe downward social mobility.
And then you have the family unit itself, which the author brilliantly refers to as the untrained treatment center. Think about the massive friction of military reintegration.
Yeah, that's a huge issue.
A soldier gets mobilized, goes to the front line for a year, and the spouse is left behind. That spouse has to fight their own exhausting war of single parenting under threat, managing constant fear for their partner's life, and perhaps dealing with the logistics of displacement.
Exactly. I mean, spot on.
Then the soldier comes back. The soldier expects rest, peace, and immense gratitude. But the family expects practical help with the chores and immediate emotional presence. Both sides are completely wounded and running on empty.
And if they don't have external structural support, the family collapses under the combined weight of untreated moral injury, hyperarousal, or depression.
It's a powder keg.
It is. The spouse and children urgently need education on what to expect from a traumatized nervous system. They need financial clarity and accessible counseling options. The state can't just drop a highly traumatized veteran back into a highly traumatized household, close the door, and expect the family to magically heal itself. That is a recipe for domestic crisis.
The text also elevates the status of schools in a way I hadn't fully considered before. Remember the UNHCR warning about the 1.5 million children at risk of long-term consequences? The author argues that schools should be viewed directly as security institutions.
A school provides the single most vital psychological anchor for a child in a conflict zone: routine.
Just having something predictable.
Yes. When a teacher manages to maintain a predictable, structured routine, even if they have to hold the math class in a concrete basement shelter during an active air alarm, they are doing far more than teaching fractions.
Right.
They are actively defending the civic identity of the nation. They are protecting the developing prefrontal cortexes of the children. They are safeguarding the future economic capacity of the country. Children who lose their education, their routine, and their ability to trust the adults around them become a lost generation.
And that's a security threat in itself.
It's a massive, unfixable security threat 20 years down the line when those children are supposed to be the workforce and the leadership.
That brings up another critical concept from the text: social trust. How does all of this unaddressed, compounding trauma actually shatter social trust across a nation?
Unaddressed trauma privatizes human suffering. It turns citizens into isolated, hypervigilant survivors who only have the bandwidth to look out for their immediate biological circle.
They just pull inward.
The text notes that this intense isolation breeds widespread distrust. Citizens begin to deeply distrust their political leaders. Refugees who fled distrust the citizens who stayed behind, and vice versa.
Wow, it really splinters everyone.
Yeah. The bereaved who have lost loved ones distrust any political language of hope or victory. This societal fracture, this erosion of trust between neighbors, is the exact vulnerability that enemy information operations and psychological warfare units try to exploit. They want the society to turn on itself.
So how do you counter that level of distrust? You can't just pass a law mandating that people trust each other again.
No, you can't. The source material advocates for a massive community-based care model. The sheer volume of need is simply too large for the limited number of psychiatrists and psychologists to handle alone.
So what's the plan?
The state must systematically train primary care doctors, clergy members, school teachers, and social workers to provide basic psychological support and identify the early signs of distress.
Oh, I see.
However, the text issues a very strong caveat here. These community members must not act as amateur, untrained therapists for severe clinical issues like psychosis or active suicidality.
Right, that would be dangerous.
Very. Their role is to provide a sense of belonging and basic care while serving as a reliable bridge to connect severe cases with clinical professionals.
Okay, we have thoroughly covered the scale of the problem, the specific biological and moral nature of the wounds, and how this trauma ripples out to impact families, the economy, and overall social trust. The deep dive concludes its analysis by looking at the concrete, systemic policy solutions proposed by the author.
Yes, the 6 pillars.
They call it building a resilient, long-term national security architecture. Because, as the text notes, heroic volunteerism and short-term emergency grants are amazing in the first year of a crisis, but they cannot sustain a nation's mental health for decades.
That's right.
We need to break down the blueprint provided in the text. Let's go through the 6 pillars of this architecture in detail. Lay them out for us.
I'll walk through the 6 distinct pillars outlined by the author. The first pillar is military prevention.
Okay.
This means moving away from just treating injuries after they happen and actively implementing realistic stress inoculation training. It involves strictly enforcing sleep discipline wherever possible because severe sleep deprivation mimics mild psychosis and drastically increases the likelihood of PTSD.
Sleep is that critical, huh?
It's vital. It also involves utilizing organized peer support networks and embedding clinical mental health teams directly within military units. The goal is to reduce preventable psychological damage before the soldier even finishes their deployment.
That makes a lot of sense. Pillar 2 is evidence-based treatment. This involves establishing a seamless continuum of care. The author uses a great physical medical example here to illustrate the point.
Wait, the amputee example.
Yeah, an amputee needs acute surgical intervention, obviously. But the care doesn't stop there. They also need sleep care, pain management, physical therapy, and family support counseling.
Exactly. Yes, absolutely.
If these services are siloed and fragmented across different agencies, the wounded person has to become the full-time case manager for their own suffering. Navigating bureaucracy while traumatized is exhausting and leads to people dropping out of the system. The state must integrate these services.
Pillar 3 focuses on veteran reintegration. Demobilization for the military must not be a sudden cliff that a soldier falls off.
Right.
Veterans need structured transition planning before they leave the service. They need dedicated help in navigating complex state benefits. But most importantly, they need meaningful, respected roles in civilian society.
To give them a purpose.
Yes. They need jobs that utilize their leadership skills. They need to be viewed by the society as highly capable assets, not as broken objects of pity or charity.
Pillar 4 is child and family protection. This involves aggressively implementing trauma-informed training in all schools so teachers understand why a child might be acting out aggressively or withdrawing entirely. It also means giving parents actual, practical guidance on how to handle their children's exposure to violent media and how to decode severe behavioral changes. The state has to view protecting the mental health of children as protecting the future electorate and the future labor force.
Pillar 5 is what the author calls data with dignity. To manage a nationwide public health response, the state must utilize broad surveillance and data collection to find gaps in care across different geographic regions and demographics.
But privacy is a huge concern there.
Huge. That's why this data collection must be backed by the absolute strictest cybersecurity and anti-discrimination safeguards. If a soldier fears that seeking psychological help will permanently end their military career, or a civilian fears a permanent psychiatric stigma on their employment record, they will actively avoid the system entirely. Trust in the data system is non-negotiable.
And the final pillar, number 6, brings us back to that deepest, most complex wound we discussed earlier, moral and civic repair. This pillar recognizes that medicine alone is insufficient. It combines clinical care, religious and spiritual support, clear legal frameworks regarding rules of engagement, and restorative community practices. The overarching goal is to restore a sense of truth, personal responsibility, and social belonging to those who feel completely alienated by their wartime experiences.
The author also provides a crucial, final warning regarding the implementation of these pillars, specifically regarding cultural adaptation.
Okay, what's the warning?
International partners and allied nations will offer massive funding and prepackaged models of psychiatric care. But those imported models must adapt to the specific local reality.
You can't just copy and paste a system.
No, you can't. They have to account for the nuances of the local language, the highly specific military culture, and the heavy historical legacy of psychiatric stigma in the region. If a model feels foreign or clinical in the wrong way, it will be rejected. The system must be locally trusted and culturally resonant to be utilized by the population.
That brings us to our final synthesis of this analysis. The core paradigm shift required by the source text is striking in its implications. Healing is not a luxury reserved for a time of peace. to be addressed after security is achieved on the battlefield.
Yeah.
Healing is one of the primary active conditions by which security is maintained right now. You simply cannot separate the physiological and psychological resilience of the citizen from the hard strategic strength of the state.
The human foundation is the literal bedrock of the state. If that human foundation cracks due to untreated trauma, exhaustion, and moral injury, the physical territory and the military hardware mean very little.
Which leaves me with a final provocative thought for you to mull over. We've talked entirely about a nation currently locked in a long, brutal war of attrition. But if psychological resilience, robust social trust, and the cognitive capacity to metabolize fear are the ultimate measures of national defense, well, how might this redefine the way all nations prepare for future conflicts before a single shot is ever fired?
That's a huge question.
Right. Could the mental health infrastructure of peacetime, the strength and cohesion of our local communities, and our ability to honestly process truth and moral responsibility be the true, unrecognized deterrent against modern warfare? Are healthy minds the ultimate anti-missile system?
This raises a massive question about how we view peacetime investments in human flourishing. It suggests that a well-cared-for population is the hardest target to break.
A question worth holding on to long after this conversation ends. Thank you for joining us today for this deep dive into the source material. We have looked at the warning lights flashing on the dashboard of a nation, the broken hardware and crashed operating systems of trauma, and the comprehensive architecture required to rebuild a society from the inside out. We will see you next time.